A Soviet nail factory is told to produce 5 tons of nails, so it makes one enormous 5-ton nail. The target is met. The nail is useless. Next quarter, the factory is told to produce 10,000 nails, so it makes 10,000 nails as thin as sewing needles. Again, the target is met. Again, the product is useless. This is not only a story about the Soviet Union. The same logic has produced fake bank accounts, manipulated test scores, distorted hospital statistics, and social media systems optimized for outrage. The moment a measurement becomes the goal, the measurement begins to lie. There is a name for this. In 1975, the British economist Charles Goodhart described how statistical relationships tend to break down once policymakers use them for control. The idea was later popularized in a simpler form. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The Soviet Union didn't need Charles Goodhart to tell them this. Soviet factory managers had been proving it since the 1930s, 40 years before Goodhart put it into words. Here's why it works. The moment you tie rewards to a specific metric, people stop optimizing for the thing you actually care about and start optimizing for the metric itself. The metric was supposed to be a proxy for, are we doing a good job? But the moment it becomes a target, the proxy is all anyone chases. The original goal, useful nails, quality healthcare, good education, drops out of the picture entirely. Think about the hospital example. You want shorter wait times, so you set a 4-hour limit. Hospitals respond by reclassifying patients into assessment areas that technically aren't waiting rooms. The numbers improve, the care doesn't. The Soviet Union did the same thing, but across an entire economy, every factory, every farm, every mine, measured by a central authority, with bonuses for hitting targets and punishment for missing them. The Soviet planning system was vast. By the late Soviet period, the economy contained tens of millions of distinct products and product variants. God's plan directly set targets for several thousand of the most important ones, while ministries and lower planning bodies tried to coordinate the rest. Each metric created a new way to cheat. Glass factories measured by tonnage produced glass so thick it was nearly opaque. Textile factories measured by linear meters produced fabric so narrow you couldn't make clothing from it. These are documented cases from Soviet economic records. The planning authorities tried to fix the problem the only way they knew how, by adding more metrics, quality indicators, material usage ratios, customer satisfaction surveys. But each new metric just created new gaming opportunities. By the 1970s, a typical Soviet enterprise was evaluated on dozens of separate indicators. Factory managers spend more time optimizing their reports than optimizing their production. There's a widely told Soviet joke about a regional official who visits a collective farm and asks the chairman how the harvest went. The chairman answers, "The harvest was excellent. The grain is stored, the barns are full, and the report has already reached Moscow." The official looks confused and says, "But I just walked through the fields. There's nothing growing out there." The chairman smiles. "The grain doesn't matter. The report has already reached Moscow." That joke isn't just about lying. It's about what happens when the reporting system becomes more real than the thing being reported. The grain doesn't exist, but the report does. And the report is what Moscow sees. This brings us to what might be the most famous Soviet joke of all, and the most economically precise. A worker is asked about life under socialism. He shrugs. "They pretend to pay us. We pretend to work." That's a clinical description of what economists call a low-effort equilibrium. If your pay doesn't depend on your output, and in the Soviet system, it largely didn't, then working harder gains you little. Dismissal was difficult. and unemployment was not allowed to function as a normal disciplinary mechanism. The enterprise couldn't go bankrupt because the state covered all losses. The rewards for extra effort were often weak, while exceeding the plan could create harder targets later. So everyone settled into the same pattern: minimal effort, minimal output, maximal reporting. The Hungarian economist János Kornai described this as the quantity-drive enterprises focused exclusively on hitting plan targets in the easiest possible way, with zero incentive to innovate, improve quality, or respond to what consumers actually needed. The workers weren't irrational. They were responding perfectly to the incentives in front of them. That's the tragedy. The system didn't fail because people were lazy or corrupt. It failed because it made rational behavior destructive. But there's one more mechanism that made everything worse. Economists call it the ratchet effect. If your factory produced 1,000 tons of steel this year, next year's plan would be set based on this year's output, and it would be higher, maybe 1,050 tons, then 1,100, then 1,150. Each year, the target ratchets upward based on what you achieved last year. So what's the rational strategy? Never exceed your target by too much. If you produce 1,200 tons this year, next year they'll expect 1,260. The year after, 1,320. You've built a trap for yourself by doing a good job. The smart factory manager produces exactly 1,001 tons, just barely over target, enough to claim the bonus. Not enough to raise the baseline. There's a joke about an old worker who's asked what the most important part of a plan is. He thinks for a moment and says, the most important part of a plan is not its fulfillment, but its announcement. That old man understood the ratchet effect perfectly. The system doesn't reward actual achievement. It rewards the appearance of steady, modest progress. Anything beyond that is punished not with a reprimand, but with a higher target next year. The result was bizarre. Soviet enterprises systematically hid their true productive capacity from the state. Factories that could produce more deliberately produced less. Workers who could work faster deliberately slowed down. The planning system, designed to maximize output, created universal incentives to minimize it. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises had argued in 1920 that rational economic calculation is impossible without market prices, that a central planner cannot know what to produce, in what quantities, for whom, because without prices, there is no information. The Soviet experiment spent 70 years testing that claim, one gaming strategy at a time. Now, you might think this is ancient history. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Who cares about their nail factories? You should, because Goodhart's law didn't die with the USSR. Wells Fargo employees opened millions of fake accounts to hit sales targets. Teachers in Atlanta changed students' test scores to meet federal accountability metrics. Hospitals reclassified patients to hit wait time targets. Social media platforms optimized for engagement and got an epidemic of rage. Every time an organization sets a metric and ties rewards to it, it creates the same incentive structure the Soviet Union had. The target becomes the enemy of the goal. The difference is scale. In a market economy, Goodhart's law operates within individual organizations, and market pressures, competition, bankruptcy, regulation, lawsuits can provide corrective forces, although none of them works automatically. In the Soviet Union, Goodhart's law operated across the entire economy at the same time. Every factory, every farm, every ministry, all gaming the same central authority, simultaneously, with no external reality check to course correct. The whole country was one giant nail factory, and the nail was 5 tons and useless. The Soviet jokes about this aren't relics, they're warnings. When you hear, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work, that's not just about the USSR. That's about any system where measurement replaces meaning, where the report becomes more important than the reality, where hitting the number matters more than doing the job. The Soviets told these jokes in kitchens, at risk of arrest. We can tell them on YouTube, but the insight is the same. Next episode, we'll look at what happens when the gap between propaganda and reality becomes so wide that everyone knows it's a lie, but everyone pretends not to know. That's the story of Soviet propaganda collapse, and the jokes are darker,